The fourth step in our milling process is the crosscut. We just did a crosscut on the table saw using a miter gauge, but as I mentioned there, it's not the best choice. The best choice would be the miter saw in our shop. But before I go to the miter saw, if I'm building my Viking box, I've got my two rips like the plan says. They've been planed to 5/8, they've been ripped to 4 1/4. And now I want to mark out the ends of my box in the front and back. And we provide students with these templates just to kind of help them figure out where they're going to get the yield from their project. These represent the front and back, the short ones represent the sides. It really doesn't matter which order you take them off, you just look at the wood, think about what you want to show and what you don't want to show, and place them accordingly. I could take both sides off one, I could take both front and backs, or I could mix. And in this case, I think I'm going to put these knots on the side, and I'll put these kind of freckled parts in the front and back. So I get those where I want them, and they're a template. They're really just a rough marking of where I'm going to cut it. And one of the important things to note when we go to the miter saw is that I got to pay close attention to the part of the board that I want to keep. I just mark the parts I want to keep, so it's going to be really important that when I bring the blade down on the miter saws, that I get that blade on the correct side of the line. Sometimes it might be on the left, sometimes it might be on the right, but I never want to lose focus of what part of the board I'm keeping, or I might end up cutting my boards too short. So the best choice for crosscuts in our shop is the miter saw. This is a standard 10-inch miter saw, and it gets its name because the blade is 10 inches in diameter. This is a good, accurate piece of equipment. Again, it has a fence just like the table saw rip, just like the jointer. So if it has a fence, there's a reason, and you should keep your material tight against it. The other rule that you need to adhere to is the 4-inch rule. I never want to get my fingers any closer than 4 inches to any blade or bit. But on this saw especially, 4 inches means no closer than. Doesn't mean you have to get within 4 inches. So my advice is get away as far as you can. If you can get 6 inches away, get 6 inches away. The way this saw works, you start the blade and you just lower the saw through the wood. This saw cuts accurately 45 degrees left or right. That's how it gets its name of miter saw. And by miter saw, it's referring to the cut of a miter, which finished carpenters might make. Doing trim around a door or window at a 45 degree, much like a picture frame. And that's called a miter joint, and that's why it gets its name, miter saw. So again, this is our simplest version, our standard 10-inch miter saw, accurate miters left or right, 45 degrees. But what we're going to use it for is just a straight, square cut. So again, I want to be sure that my blade is on the correct side of the line. And one of the things, incidentally, that you should know about this miter saw is what's the biggest board it can cut. Well, the widest board I can cut on this saw is about 5 inches. That's how far the blade reaches, and that is on the test. So if I had a board that was over 5, I wouldn't want to try to attempt to cut it. I would go to one of the other miter saws, which can cut a little bit longer, but standard 10-inch miter saw, maximum cross cut 5 inches. So I place my board on the bed, I make sure my hand's positioned at least 4 inches away, and then I bring the blade down and I don't have my hand on the trigger because I don't want to accidentally start it, and I'm just looking at the edge of the tooth on the other side, and I'm right up to the line. I'm not on the line, I'm next to the line. And one of the things I want to emphasize on a miter saw is that when in doubt, leave it a little long. You can always go back and trim a little bit more, but you can't put it back on. Once it's gone, it's gone. So I line up my blade, I'm on the outside of my line, I'm keeping in mind what I want to keep, and I just start the saw, I let it come to full speed, and then nice and easy, I bring it through the wood. There is a stop inside the saw. It'll stop itself from cutting into the base, so you don't have to worry about that. And this guard should retract and then also come back over the blade when you're done with your cut. So there's that cut. Well, if I wanted to cut this side, now my blade's going to be on the other side. Now my blade's on the left. Last time it was on the right. There's the edge of the tooth. It's right next to the line. It's not on the line. It's not over the line. It's next to the line. Tight against the fence, 4-inch rule. And I make that cut. And what I'm doing now, I consider cutting. I consider this a little bit of a rough cut, knowing I might go back and trim for length. But these cuts are accurate as far as being 90 degrees. And these are what I call my square up cuts. I'm making sure that I have a nice square end on my board. One of the things I like to point out is that when you go get a board out of the wood room, you know, if the only thing you've ever built is a fort in your backyard and you look at that end, that looks pretty straight, but it's probably not straight enough for what we're doing. Since this is more of a furniture type project, we want to assume that that's not straight, and we're going to assume it's at a square. So we're always starting with a fresh cut. And there's a question on the test that asks you, how many cuts do you need to cut a board accurately to length? And typically it's 2. One square up cut, and then one cut to length. Cut the other end. So this is, we have 3 types of miter saws in our shop. That was the standard 10-inch miter saw, cuts up to a 5-inch crosscut. This is the second type we have, and just like the other miter saw, you pull it down through the wood. It's got a fence, it's got a base. It cuts accurately, left or right, 45 degrees. But what sets this saw apart is it also tilts. I can cut a angle, or I can cut a bevel on a vertical plane, and I could do it on a horizontal plane at the same time. I could cut 2 angle planes simultaneously, and that's what gives this particular saw its name. This is a compound miter saw, and compound because it can cut 2 angles at the same time. But we don't use it for that. We just make straight cuts with it. One thing I do want to point out is that our compound miter saw has a bigger blade than the standard 10-inch. This one has a 12-inch blade, which allows it to make a bigger crosscut. And you can cut up to an 8-inch piece about on this compound miter saw. But it works the same as the other one. In fact, when I do my sign-offs, I do it on this one because, number one, it's my favorite. But also I find that kids tend to be more frightened of this one than the others because it's got a bigger blade, it's got a little bit more of a kick. When you turn it on, it can be a little startling. But it's a good, sturdy, accurate saw, and my rationale is if they'll use this one, they'll have no problem using the other 2. So again, I want to cut on the outsides of my line. I bring down my blade, I can see the edge of the tooth, I make sure I'm tight against the fence. And one point I want to make here is that I'm actually pushing into the fence and I'm pushing the board down. I'm not putting my hand like this where I could possibly roll the board. I'm pushing it down and in, and I'm not pushing towards the blade either. I'm just pushing straight into the fence. Line up my blade, let it come to full speed. Make my cut. Now I'm going to be on the other side of the line. So here's a situation that can cause a little confusion for new students. They'll get down to here. Hopefully you never see this one. Well, we know that doesn't look safe. Well, at that point, you know, my hands are not 4 inches away, so I would just rotate the piece around. And now the blade will be on the other side of the line, but my cut is safe. So one more step in the Viking box process that we get to at this point. I want to remind you that the templates were more of a rough cut. And I want to check my pieces, and I want to make sure that they're identical in length. They almost never are. I put them on in, and I'm going to stack them again on the saw. I'm going to keep them nice and flush on this end, and I'm going to carefully bring the blade down. I've got the longer board on the bottom, and I just barely rub the top one with the blade, but the bottom board's actually stopping it. So now I'm flush, short one on top. I'm just going to trim both so I know I have a perfect match. That's going to be critical to the accuracy of my project. These two, they are almost identical, but I can feel that one's just slightly longer. And now I've got my front, back, and sides ready for the Viking box. The third type of miter saw we use in our shop is just like the other two in that it cuts accurate 45 degrees left or right. So it's a miter saw. This one has a 10-inch blade like the first one. Just like the second one though, the head on this one tilts, so therefore it's a compound miter saw as well. I can cut two angle planes at the same time. But the other thing that this saw does that the other two don't is this one has a sliding function. So this one is called a sliding compound miter saw. And it works the same way as the others, except if I'm using the sliding portion, it's important that I push the board, or push the saw through the board, not pull it. And there's some confusion with that with some students because they've used a radial arm saw at some point in their life, and with a radial arm saw you typically pull it through the wood. Well, with a sliding compound miter saw, they are intended to push through the wood. And pretty much the only time we use this saw in Woods 1 is to cross-cut our big boards. There's a point in your project where you get a second board and you cross-cut it just about in half at about 11 1/4. And that's when we come to the slider, because the sliding compound miter saw will cut up to 12 inches. So I hold it against the fence just like I did before. I'm at least 4 inches away from the path of the board. I'm going to start the saw, I'm going to plunge it down, and then I'm going to push it through the wood. One quick point I want to make about the sliding compound miter saw. This saw, more than any other, at times causes me to want to call it a day and go home. When I look over here and I see students attempting to make rip cuts on the sliding compound miter saw. Oops. Student has a board like this, and they say, well, I want to trim a little bit off there. And they come over to the slider, and hopefully at this point this does not look safe to students, but their mind works that, well, I can trim a little bit off. Well, this one definitely is a trip to the hospital. This is really, really dangerous. It's not stable. Never ever attempt to make rip cuts on the sliding compound miter saw. Do not make rip cuts on any of the miter saws.